Close your eyes and imagine you're walking through the echoing marble halls of a grand 17th-century French chateau. Outside, the wind whispers through the elaborate geometrical gardens. Inside, heavy velvet curtains dampen the light, and the faint scent of beeswax and rose water hangs in the air. You pass by a long mahogany table set for a feast, but instead of roasted meats or fine cheeses, your eyes are drawn to a single object on a silver pedestal at the center of the table. A pineapple. Not sliced, not cooked, not eaten, just sitting there. Alone. Untouched. As if it were too sacred, or too feared. In the opulent world of French nobility during the reign of Louis XIV, the pineapple was not simply a tropical fruit. It was an alien object, rare, precious, and more terrifying than you might think. Imported from the Caribbean colonies, pineapples were incredibly difficult to grow and even harder to transport. By the time one reached France, it was bruised, sour, and barely edible. And yet, the sight of one could trigger a cascade of political maneuvering, social tension, and even fear. But why would such a fruit instill fear in France's upper class? To understand this, we need to slowly peel back the historical layers, not unlike removing the rough skin of a pineapple, until we reach the strangely mundane, yet powerful core of this odd story. Let's begin with the context. The 17th century in France was an era dominated by etiquette, hierarchy, and optics. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had transformed the French court into a theater of power and performance. Every gesture, every garment, every object on a banquet table carried symbolic weight. Status wasn't just inherited, it had to be displayed, performed, and reinforced daily. Into this performative culture entered the pineapple, an exotic and ostentatious item from the New World colonies. It was part of a broader wave of colonial imports, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, that reshaped the elite's habits. But the pineapple was different. It was too fragile to be common, too expensive to be ordinary, and too strange to be neutral. A single pineapple could cost more than a year's salary for a lower nobleman. Most nobles never tasted one in their lives. And for those lucky, or unlucky, enough to display one at a dinner party, the pressure was immense. Displaying a pineapple was like announcing your connections to the global economy. It meant you had ties to the Caribbean sugar plantations, that you owned ships or knew someone who did, that you had cash to burn and taste to prove it. But it also meant you were exposed to colonial rumors, diseases, and debts. The fruit came soaked in symbolism, tropical decadence, colonial exploitation, and even hidden danger. One diary from 1694 recounts a noblewoman at court fainting upon seeing a pineapple at a rival's party. Not because she feared the fruit itself, but because it implied that she had fallen behind in the social race. Her family had no Caribbean holdings. No merchants in their pocket. No pineapple of their own. The fear, then, was not of the pineapple's taste, but of what it said about you. In fact, many nobles didn't even know how to prepare one. Some tried boiling them. Others roasted them like apples. One comically tragic account speaks of a duke who instructed his chef to bake a pineapple into a meat pie. The result reportedly sent a guest to the physician, citing an internal imbalance of the humors. Servants, who often had more contact with the pineapples during transport and preparation, developed folk beliefs about their effect. Some whispered that pineapples absorbed the tropical spirits of the colonies, souls of the enslaved who had died growing them. Others believed pineapples spoiled the air and brought illness, much like the old miasma theories that connected smell with disease. Meanwhile, a small class of botanical enthusiasts in Paris was racing to grow pineapples in hothouses, early greenhouses that used candles, mirrors, and glass to simulate Caribbean sunlight. These hothouses became symbols of secret knowledge and imperial control. The race to grow pineapples locally turned into a quiet arms race among nobles, especially those trying to impress the royal court. One man, Count Armand de Valmont, became infamous for cultivating the first French-grown pineapple in 1679. He paraded it on a velvet pillow in front of Versailles, refusing to eat it, choosing instead to preserve it in alcohol as a trophy. Others followed suit. Within a decade, stuffed and lacquered pineapples began appearing in noble homes as permanent decor. But behind all this pineapple theater was a deeper unease. France's economic stability in the late 17th century was increasingly reliant on its overseas colonies. The sugar trade, in particular, was lucrative but deeply unstable. Wars, piracy, and rebellion frequently interrupted supply lines. The pineapple, in all its fragility, became a symbol of this delicate balance. A beautiful object, easily ruined. A sign of wealth, but also vulnerability. By the 1690s, rumors spread that consuming pineapples caused infertility in women and melancholy in men. A treatise by a minor physician, Dr. Etienne Collat, warned that the pineapple's hot nature could disrupt the body's humors. He was largely ignored by the royal court, but his writings circulated among the lesser nobility, who took it as a sign to avoid the fruit. In salons, people debated the pineapple's symbolism. Was it a mark of refined taste, or a decadent trap? Some saw it as a quiet curse, a fruit that made you visible, desirable, and therefore vulnerable to gossip, political attack, or social decline. The irony was that the pineapple itself didn't matter. It was often too unripe to eat or too precious to slice. It was rarely consumed. Instead, it hovered on the edge of noble consciousness like a jewel with a bitter center. So how did a fruit meant to delight the senses come to symbolize so many anxieties? And what does this say about the way power, performance, and objects intertwine in elite society? The year is 1683. Versailles is at the height of its grandeur, and the gardens are whispering secrets beneath the rows of orange trees in their delicate orangeries. The court of Louis XIV, dense with perfume, powdered wigs, and political games, is a place where even silence is strategic. And somewhere, behind glass walls and heated stones, a single pineapple is ripening. In the royal estate at Choisy, a small group of royal gardeners, many of them imported Dutch specialists, are attempting what seems impossible, to cultivate a tropical fruit in the unpredictable climate of France. They wake before dawn, checking candlelit chambers and adjusting brass ventilation pipes to maintain humidity. Every pineapple plant has its own name, its own attendant, and its own hourly care log. To grow a pineapple in mainland France wasn't simply an agricultural challenge, it was a performance of control over nature, distance, and empire. And yet, that very performance revealed how fragile the illusion really was. The pineapple became a metaphor for colonial ambition and its discontents. Much like France's Caribbean colonies, Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, and Martinique, the fruit required constant attention, heavy investment, and came with moral ambiguity. French nobles began to compete not in how many pineapples they owned, but in who could grow one domestically. The successful cultivation of a pineapple on French soil implied dominion over foreign environments and mastery of imperial science. The hothouses built for this purpose were architectural marvels, narrow, glass-roof structures, often heated by manure pits or coal-fed flues. Some had retractable windows, copper gutters, and even early forms of automated watering systems. At the estate of the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, records show that over 3,000 livres were spent annually on heating a single hothouse for just 2 fruiting pineapples. Servants began circulating legends. Some believed that pineapples could only grow when spoken to gently every morning. Others whispered that a gardener once dropped dead from a tropical fever while tending a plant, the fruit stealing his soul. Whether myth or not, these stories illustrate the blend of scientific curiosity and eerie superstition that surrounded the fruit's cultivation. Meanwhile, at Versailles, nobles jockeyed for favor by presenting pineapples, not to eat, but to gift. A pineapple was a symbol of allegiance, a visual essay in loyalty to the king. One such offering, recorded in the diary of a courtier named Henriette de Louvigny, took place at a masked ball. A minor baron, desperate to impress, unveiled a single pineapple inside a gilded cage, carried by a dwarf in silk livery. The gesture earned him a small pension and several months of social favor. But like all social gestures in court life, it could backfire. In 1686, the Marquise de Fauntleroy gifted a pineapple to Madame de Maintenon, the king's influential consort. What was meant as a respectful token turned into scandal when it was discovered that the pineapple had come from Dutch merchants, political enemies of France at the time. The Marquise was quietly exiled from court. Not for disloyalty, but for bad optics. The court had become saturated with semiotic anxiety. What did each object say about your values, your alliances, your ambitions? The pineapple, like certain imported fabrics or scented waters, had crossed the line from luxury into symbolic landmine. Writers and pamphleteers began to parody this absurdity. A satirical play titled La Tragédie du Fruit d'Or, The Tragedy of the Golden Fruit, was performed secretly in Paris salons, mocking nobles who paid fortunes for pineapples only to let them rot for fear of being seen eating them incorrectly. One character, a fictional Count de Lananas, bankrupts his estate buying 5 pineapples, each more sour than the last, and ultimately loses his mind to fruit-induced delusions. But even while the intelligentsia mocked, they also feared. A quiet undercurrent of class resentment was building in France's urban centers. Bakers in Paris joked that nobles ate gold and sweated perfume. Merchants grumbled that while their wives nursed fevers in shared beds, aristocrats debated the proper fork with which to prod a pineapple. And the pineapple itself began to appear in art, more frequently, and more symbolically. In still-life paintings, it appeared nestled between rotting grapes or beside extinguished candles, alluding to the transience of power. In tapestries, it was woven alongside allegories of envy or vanity. Pineapple motifs even appeared in garden gates and porcelain ware, as a kind of quiet code: we are part of the world. We control the seas. But of course, they didn't. The pineapple, in all its exotic glory, served as a reminder of the limits of aristocratic control. Colonial supply lines grew increasingly fragile. Hurricanes, slave uprisings, and shifting alliances made every pineapple shipment a gamble. In 1697, a pirate raid in the Caribbean reportedly led to the loss of an entire shipload of pineapples destined for the Maréchal de Villeroy's banquet. The nobleman's humiliation was so severe that he cancelled the event and retired to his country estate for 3 months. Meanwhile, in the provinces, local elites tried to emulate the capital's fruit obsessions. This led to absurdities. A bishop in Lyon reportedly ordered his clerics to honor the fruit of paradise with a hymn during a summer feast, unaware that the pineapple was already considered by many to be an unstable, unholy indulgence. It is in these contradictions that the pineapple's role becomes clearest. It was not feared because it was poisonous, or because it was misunderstood. It was feared because it reflected too much. It reflected the court's fragility beneath its gold-embroidered surface. It reflected the dependence on colonial exploitation and maritime luck. It reflected the endless hunger for symbols, for appearances, for status, no matter the cost. And so, as the century approached its close, the pineapple remained poised on its pedestal, bright, spiky, uneaten, and heavy with meaning. But how long could such a delicate, expensive, misunderstood fruit maintain its power? And what would happen when the people, tired of pageantry and hunger, stopped laughing at the parody and started sharpening their knives. It is the summer of 1709. The royal gardens at Versailles are wilting under a relentless sun, and across the countryside of France, famine has begun to spread like a stain. A brutal winter, followed by failed harvests and rising grain prices, has left entire villages hollow-eyed and hungry. But in the grand salons of Paris and the manicured estates of the nobility, pineapples still gleam beneath crystal chandeliers. Or at least, they try to. Something has begun to shift. In previous decades, the pineapple was a crown jewel of elite taste, an emblem of global power, and a trophy of imperial reach. But now, that golden aura has started to decay. Slowly. Quietly. Like overripe fruit in a darkened pantry. The noble obsession with exotic foods, pineapples, cocoa, sugar, spices, was beginning to draw uncomfortable attention from the masses. As bread riots erupted in the outer arrondissements of Paris, and pamphleteers distributed caricatures of nobles dining on gold while the poor gnaw bark, the pineapple became an unwilling symbol of grotesque disparity. And it wasn't just the poor who were beginning to see it that way. Inside Versailles itself, voices were growing more cautious. A few daring courtiers, noting the tension in the air, began to treat the pineapple not as a desirable status symbol but as a dangerous one. A risk. A provocation. Something too extravagant. In one widely whispered incident from 1710, a viscount arranged a pineapple-themed masquerade in his Paris residence. The invitation featured an engraving of the host in a pineapple mask, holding a sword made of sugar. But before the event could be held, protesters gathered outside his home, chanting rhymes about fruit for kings and famine for France. The party was quietly cancelled. The Viscount left the city for Vienna within the week. At the same time, intellectuals and critics began reframing the pineapple not as a marvel, but as a mirror. Voltaire, still a young man in these years, reportedly mocked the nobility's obsession with the fruit in a private letter. A society that grows fruit it cannot eat, at a cost it cannot afford, to please guests it cannot trust, this is no society at all. It is a stage set for a farce, with pineapples for props. Others took a darker view. A priest writing anonymously in 1711 described the fruit as a symbol of temptation, not unlike the apple of Eden, and warned that it may one day herald the fall of the house of privilege, as it once did for man. The pineapple was no longer safe. And so, it began to disappear. Not entirely, of course. The fruit still existed in botanical gardens and merchant docks. But it vanished from the center of court life. Nobles stopped giving them as gifts. Artists ceased painting them. Hothouses were repurposed for citrus or closed entirely. Even the royal gardener, once tasked with managing Louis XIV's prized greenhouse pineapples, was reassigned to ornamental fountains. For a while, the silence around pineapples was deafening. No one quite admitted that the symbol had soured. They simply moved on. But the implications lingered. In the following decades, as France drifted toward revolution, historians would come to see the pineapple not as a minor detail of court life, but as an artifact of everything that was about to collapse. Its journey, from exotic prize to object of satire, from symbol of imperial command to emblem of foolish excess, mirrored the journey of the nobility itself. At the height of its power, the pineapple was untouchable. Not to be sliced, eaten, or questioned. It was too perfect, too important. Like a crown balanced on a table, glinting in the candlelight, heavy with silence. But beneath the surface, rot had already set in. The pineapple was never just a fruit. It was a message, one the nobility didn't understand until it was too late. By the 1780s, on the eve of revolution, the pineapple reappeared, but not in salons. This time, it showed up in the drawings of revolutionary artists, portrayed not as luxury, but as folly. In one popular engraving, a bloated nobleman sits at a table surrounded by starving peasants, blissfully cutting into a pineapple that drips with blood. It was satire, yes. But it also told a truth. Objects, even sweet, sun-grown fruits, can become dangerous when their meaning drifts too far from the lives of the people. The pineapple had once symbolized empire, taste, and class. But in the end, it symbolized something else, the fatal blindness of privilege. And that, perhaps, is the most curious thing of all. How did a single fruit, barely edible, difficult to grow, and never meant to be eaten, come to embody an entire class's rise and fall? And what symbols, we might ask ourselves today, are sitting quietly on our own tables? Picture the Roman Empire at its height, vast, orderly, ruthless. Roads stretching like veins across continents. Aqueducts channeling water through arid hills. Soldiers moving in lockstep under the weight of empire, armored, disciplined, and unstoppable. Now picture this, a legionnaire in Britannia, in the dead of winter, trudging through mud and frost, his feet wrapped in torn linen, toes numb, boots soaked through. And then imagine this same soldier, several campaigns later, walking not in misery, but in comfort. His sandals no longer biting into frozen skin. His toes dry. His stride steady. The difference? Socks. Yes, socks. In the grand pantheon of Roman achievements, law, language, architecture, few would stop to think about hosiery. Yet buried in the layers of what the Romans called vestitus, clothing, the simple innovation of socks played a quiet but transformative role in the daily life and military success of the Roman state. We begin in the north, far from Rome's sun-drenched forums and marble villas. The Roman occupation of Britannia, starting in 43 CE, tested the empire's mettle, not just politically, but physically. The cold damp of the British Isles was unlike anything Roman soldiers had trained for. Their traditional footwear, the caligae, a heavy, open-toed leather sandal with hobnails for grip, was ideal for Mediterranean heat, but cruel in the northern cold. Early letters discovered at Vindolanda, a Roman fort just south of Hadrian's Wall, tell us much. Written in ink on thin wood, they are some of the earliest examples of Latin handwriting in Britain. In them, soldiers request everything from beer to birthday parties, and, crucially, socks. One such note, likely written by a soldier's servant or clerk, reads plainly: "Send more socks, sandals, and underwear. My feet are frozen." Simple. Boring. And yet profound. This request reveals how Roman soldiers adapted to conditions far beyond what their standard equipment allowed. By the 2nd century, archaeological digs show that Roman auxiliaries in northern provinces began wearing layered cloth around their feet, likely linen or wool. These were not the tailored socks we know today, but early prototypes, foot wraps, tubes, even primitive stitched foot coverings. They were called udons, and they changed everything. Unlike caligae, which were open to the elements, udons provided insulation and protection. Soldiers who wore them could march longer, survive colder climates, and avoid common ailments like frostbite or trench foot. In a system where entire military campaigns depended on endurance and rapid movement, this mattered. You might ask, why does this matter so much? Because the Roman army was more than just weapons and tactics, it was logistics. And at the heart of Roman logistics was the body of the soldier. Every minor improvement in comfort or resilience translated into major advantages on the battlefield. Dry feet meant longer marches. Warmer feet meant healthier troops. Healthier troops meant more reliable manpower for conquest and governance. And it wasn't only soldiers. As the practice of sock-wearing spread, it filtered up and down the class ladder. Wealthy Romans, especially in colder regions, began commissioning fitted socks from wool dyed with plant-based pigments. These were more luxurious, softer, and designed to be worn indoors. For them, socks became not just utility, but status. A passage from the satirist Martial teases a fellow citizen. "Your purple socks speak louder than your mouth. Are your feet senators too?" It's a joke, but it captures something real. As with most things Roman, utility became fashion. And fashion became hierarchy. Still, the most fascinating story is not in the villas, but in the muddy fields, along the frontiers of the empire. In Gaul, Germania, and Britannia, socks became tools of survival. They were stitched by camp followers, wives, and enslaved workers, who traveled with legions. Some were sewn from scraps of uniform. Others, from trade wool purchased with pay deductions. And slowly, this small adaptation gave rise to a larger shift. By the late 2nd century, Roman military manuals begin referencing foot coverings in equipment lists. Officers encouraged their use, especially during colder campaigns. Emperor Septimius Severus, whose campaigns in Caledonia, modern-day Scotland, stretched supply lines to their breaking point, reportedly ordered thousands of wool socks to be delivered north by river barges, before ordering new helmets or armor. One could argue that Severus won battles not just through strategy, but through socks. Meanwhile, in settlements near military forts, local weavers began specializing in sock production. Evidence from York and Trier shows workshops churning out not just tunics and cloaks, but udons in several sizes. It was, by all appearances, the birth of a sock industry. And still, they remained invisible in the grand narratives. No generals wrote odes to their socks. No monuments were carved in the shape of cozy toes. But beneath the clang of swords and the glare of empire, socks marched on. Quiet, warm, forgettable, and essential. So as you drift off tonight, consider this: behind every Roman campaign was a soldier. And behind every soldier, a pair of chilled feet, wrapped, stitched, and ready. But how did these humble udons evolve into the divided-toe socks we've discovered in later Roman burials? And what happened when the empire fractured? Did socks survive Rome's fall? By the 3rd century CE, the Roman world was beginning to fray at the edges. Political assassinations, economic instability, and pressure from migrating tribes created a sense of constant unease. Legions were shuffled between regions like chess pieces, often stationed in wet, wind-bitten climates far from the temperate hills of Italy. The glory of empire now required not just strength and discipline, but a new kind of quiet endurance. And beneath every soldier's endurance lay a pair of socks. It's easy to miss, in the towering legacy of Roman engineering, but textile production was one of the most complex and critical logistical systems of the empire. While aqueducts fed cities and roads carried armies, workshops, many run by enslaved artisans, fed the very skin of Roman society. Tunics, cloaks, trousers in colder regions, and yes, socks. By the time udons became standard issue among frontier soldiers, their production had matured from makeshift to methodical. The empire's textile workshops, known as gynecea, were often state-run and attached to military supply depots. In regions like Gaul, Dacia, and the Lower Rhine, these centers produced woolen foot coverings in bulk, often sized and sorted by legion. These were not decorative items. They were stitched for function, seamed for reinforcement around the heel, double-layered at the toes. Soldiers, once reliant on linen wraps or homemade foot coverings, now received issued socks as part of their winter kits. They were inspected, inventoried, repaired when possible, discarded when not. And yet, for all their mundanity, boudins reveal a shift in imperial thinking. Rome, once obsessed with Mediterranean climate and aesthetics, was now grappling with its northern commitments. The empire was adjusting, not just militarily, but culturally, to colder, damper environments. It wasn't just about surviving the weather, it was about integrating resilience into the everyday rhythms of life. Socks, humble as they were, became a barometer of this adaptation. Across archaeological digs in Germany and northern France, we've discovered fragments of socks in burial sites and refuse pits. One particularly well-preserved example, excavated in the early 20th century near Cologne, shows a child-sized wool sock, dyed reddish with madder root, and made with a split toe, likely for wear with thong-style sandals. Yes, Roman children wore socks too. And while these findings might not dazzle the way a mosaic or statue might, they tell us something deeper about life at the margins of empire, that daily comfort mattered. That innovation wasn't always grandiose. That survival often relied on quiet, threadbare persistence. As udons spread, so too did techniques for making them. In regions under Roman influence, native weaving traditions began to blend with Roman methods. In Egypt, where the dry climate preserved more ancient textiles than anywhere else in the empire, socks made with nail-binding, a single-needle looping technique, have survived for centuries. One famous example from Antinoe shows a wool sock dyed in vivid red and green stripes, with a split for the big toe, dated to the 4th or 5th century CE. Though often attributed to later Byzantium, this sock carries the DNA of Roman utility, adapted to regional taste. It likely belonged to a child. Its heel is reinforced. Its toe curled slightly from wear. But as with most things in Roman history, the story of socks was also political. By the late 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian undertook sweeping reforms to stabilize the collapsing empire. Among them was the restructuring of the military supply chain, including textiles. In his notorious edict on maximum prices, 301 CE, Diocletian listed thousands of items with fixed prices, everything from grain to gladiator wages. Among them, wool socks. The listing reads simply: Udons lanii, per par, denarii 2. Wool socks, per pair, 2 denarii. The edict was largely unenforceable, and economic turmoil continued, but its inclusion of socks tells us something subtle but powerful: these were no longer luxuries. They were expected. Commonplace. Essential. Yet even as socks became part of military routine, they began to appear in surprising places, far from forts or barracks. In religious contexts, socks were occasionally buried with the dead. Some believe they served as markers of modesty or symbols of domesticity. In other cases, especially among elites in colder regions, fine socks were passed down in wills. A 4th century will from a retired official in Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, includes: To my grandson Lucius, I leave my woolen socks, which the Moorish weaver made for my winter walks. Even here, in the minutiae of estate planning, socks left their mark. And then there were the transitions. What happened to udons as Rome shifted eastward, as Latin gave way to Greek, and Christianity began to supplant the old gods? In Byzantine art, we begin to see feet covered not by sandals, but by boots, slippers, and yes, socks. Monks in cold monasteries wrapped their feet in layers of wool, echoing the needs of long-forgotten soldiers. From Britain to Byzantium, from barracks to burial grounds, socks persisted. But their journey was not over. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, textile infrastructure disintegrated. Forts were abandoned, workshops closed, and the centralized production of military gear, including socks, faltered. In the early medieval period, socks became regional again, crafted by hand, learned through oral tradition, often coarse and uneven. Yet in certain monasteries, particularly in Ireland and northern Italy, the legacy endured. Monks copied Roman manuals. They preserved textile patterns. Some even recorded the dimensions of soldiers' gear, including foot wrappings. It was through them, in many ways, that the Roman sock survived the Dark Ages. Remember also the weaver, hunched beside a fire. The mother stitching wool into shape. The soldier easing his aching foot into a warm sock before a long march. And ask yourself, how many empires survive not through conquest, but through the comforts they quietly normalized? By the 5th century CE, the roads of empire began to crumble, not only under the weight of invading tribes, but under the quiet rot of internal fatigue. The Roman legions that once marched confidently into forests and frost no longer came home in formation. They scattered, dissolved, or were absorbed into the armies of new kings, new names, and new flags. Rome's textile workshops, like its amphitheaters and temples, fell into silence. And the humble udons, the socks that had once warmed the feet of emperor's soldiers, faded from view. But not entirely. Across the former borders of the empire, in cold hills and quiet valleys, the knowledge of sock-making persisted. Not in the grand halls of learning, but in homes. In memory. In the hands of mothers, grandmothers, and tradeswomen who passed on patterns without ever writing them down. In rural Britain, isolated from the collapse of Roman bureaucracy, archaeological traces show continued use of wool foot coverings well into the 6th century. These were rougher than Roman socks, often felted rather than woven, and shaped more by climate necessity than stylistic inheritance. But they reveal a simple truth: once the body knows warmth, it rarely chooses to forget. In the East, the Byzantine Empire absorbed and transformed Roman legacy. Byzantine soldiers wore more enclosed footwear, often lined for warmth, and religious manuscripts from the 9th and 10th centuries depict Christ and saints wearing soft, fitted footwear, likely leather or wool-lined. These illustrations are subtle echoes of the Roman sock, refined by centuries of regional evolution. But it is in the monasteries where the sock's quiet legacy endured most intimately. As monastic life spread across Europe, particularly in colder regions, monks began emphasizing modesty, routine, and bodily care as part of spiritual discipline. Manuscript margins note details about warm garments, cloaks, gloves, hoods, and yes, socks. Some monasteries kept simple looms or spinning wheels specifically for producing wool socks, to be worn during long hours of prayer in stone chapels with cold floors. A 10th century inventory from a Benedictine abbey in Burgundy lists quinque paria udonum laniorum, 5 pairs of wool socks. The language had changed. The empire was long gone. But the object remained. The sock's journey was no longer about empire or war. It had become about continuity. About comfort. About daily life. By the 12th century, socks began to return to visibility, not as soldiers' gear, but as fashion among the wealthy. European nobles began commissioning hose, long, tight-fitting garments that covered legs and feet, often made from fine wool or silk. Though different in form, they owed their existence to the layered, practical clothing systems Rome had once refined. Still, these garments were often designed for display, not durability. The practical sock, the kind that could survive a damp trench or snowbound patrol, lived on in quieter places, in shepherds' cottages, in weavers' stalls, in the household economies of medieval women. Centuries passed. Machines were invented. Wool gave way to cotton, then to synthetic blends. But the idea remained: the foot, if it is to carry the weight of civilization, must be cared for. And the Romans, in their clanking armor and distant conquests, learned this lesson the hard way. It's curious, isn't it? The empire that built the Colosseum, that laid down the foundations of law and language across Europe, that engineered temples, roads, and aqueducts, also gave the world socks. Not with grandeur. Not with celebration. But with slow, quiet necessity. The story of udons reminds us that history doesn't live only in triumph or catastrophe. It lives in the texture of wool, in the stiffness of cold toes, in the hum of a loom, in the way someone pauses at the end of a long day and says, "Here, let me warm your feet." That too is empire. That too is legacy. So tonight, as you pull on your own socks, think not of Caesar's conquests, but of the men who marched in rain and frost, and the people behind them who made sure they didn't have to do it barefoot. Because in the end, perhaps it's not swords or stones that hold history together, but thread. Imagine a medieval castle. Not the kind from fairy tales, but a real, working fortress in the 13th century. Stone walls slick with damp. Narrow windows to keep the cold out. Courtyards echoing with the clatter of boots, neighing of horses, and the hum of daily labor. Above, nobles dine. Below, the true machinery of the kingdom churns quietly, inside kitchens lit by firelight, filled with smoke and steam and the smell of stew. This is not the history of kings and knights. This is the history of spoons. Because every bite of porridge, every trench of thick cabbage stew, every ladle of barley broth served to soldiers, servants, and squires had to be stirred by someone. And that someone, a cook, a scullion, a spit boy, held a wooden spoon, worn smooth by years of use. These spoons didn't decide battles. But without them, battles were not fought. In the medieval world, feeding people wasn't just an act of hospitality, it was a political necessity, a logistical burden, and, quite often, a miracle of timing. Let's begin in the kitchens of Edward I of England, around 1290 CE. The king is known for his military campaigns, especially in Wales and Scotland. But each campaign relied on a support system rarely mentioned in chronicles, the mobile kitchen staff, who followed the army with carts of salted meats, sacks of grains, barrels of ale, and very large spoons. Royal kitchen records, painstakingly detailed, list everything from spice purchases to firewood bundles. One record includes an entry for 10 ladles of iron and 6 spoons of ash wood, for the feeding of footmen. These were tools, yes, but also symbols of survival. Medieval armies could not live off the land indefinitely. Spoiled meat, poor grain, or lack of warm food led to illness and desertion. A well-fed army could march longer, camp harder, and, most importantly, stay loyal. Cooks in royal or noble households weren't just making food for pleasure. They were crafting calorie-dense, morale-boosting meals for dozens or hundreds of mouths, day after day. Lentil stews with dried herbs, onion porridges thickened with barley, crushed fava beans with pepper, these weren't delicacies, but they were fuel. Fuel served with wooden spoons long enough to stir cauldrons deeper than a man's torso. These spoons were not personal utensils but kitchen instruments, used to churn, check, and portion meals. Typically made of ash, beech, or elm, they were valued for their heat resistance and smoothness. A well-crafted spoon could last a decade, darkened by flame and soup. And yet, they were rarely named, rarely noticed. But dig deeper into castle records, and the spoon's quiet presence becomes clearer. In one account from the kitchens of Château de Vincennes near Paris, a steward notes: the large stirring spoon was split, replaced with a fresh piece of pine, carved by the wheelwright. Loss slowed the pottage. The loss slowed the pottage. Not the absence of a knight or a squire. A spoon. These tools, though silent and humble, kept the rhythms of castle life flowing. Meals were served according to strict hierarchy, lords first, knights second, grooms and squires after, with servants and stable hands last. Cooks had to portion accordingly. One spoonful too much for one tier meant less for the next. Some cooks marked their spoons with rings or carved initials to keep track of which belonged to which pot. Spoons touched meat could not be dipped into vegetable stews during Lent. Spoons used for noble tables could not touch the pots for footmen. In a world ruled by purity, structure, and superstition, even a spoon carried boundaries. We also find traces of the spoon in literature and religious texts that in monastic kitchens, where silence was kept, monks used gestures to communicate during meal prep. The stirring motion of a spoon was one such signal, used to indicate boiling broth or the need for more grain. In some traditions, the cook's spoon was blessed during Lent, treated as a sacred object for the act of nourishment. Spoons even made their way into the realm of punishment. In some noble households, apprentices who burned porridge or wasted ingredients were rapped on the knuckles with the stirring spoon itself. A symbolic reminder, this is the tool that feeds others. Respect it. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, spoons were carried not just by cooks, but by soldiers as part of their standard gear. Carved from horn, bone, or wood, these smaller spoons were among a soldier's most personal possessions, tied to belts, tucked into bags, passed down from veteran to youth. A soldier could lose his helmet and still eat. But without a spoon, a hot meal became difficult. So, we begin to see it clearly. The medieval spoon, by the 14th century, had become less about feasts in castles, and more about movement. Marching across enemy lands. Crossing rivers swollen with spring melt. Wintering in villages not meant to host hundreds of men. And somehow, through it all, the soldiers had to eat. Feeding an army was now a form of warfare in itself. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Food spoiled. Roads became impassable. But the cooks, those unseen logisticians of survival, adjusted. They packed their cauldrons, strapped their wooden spoons, and followed the rhythm of marching feet. A military campaign was nothing without its mobile kitchen. In England's campaigns during the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, royal quartermasters planned months in advance. Not only for swords and chainmail, but for preserved beans, dried fish, salt pork, flour, and ale. And for the tools to cook them. Among the official items requisitioned were portable iron pots, trestle tables for butchery, bags of onions, and bundles of wooden spoons, each about 3 feet long. 3 feet. Why? Because medieval military kitchens used war cauldrons, deep, soot-black kettles, sometimes as wide as a grown man's outstretched arms. These sat on tripods or hanging chains, bubbling over open fires dug into the ground. To reach the bottom, to stir the thick, glutinous mix of lentils, barley, or salted meat, you needed a spoon long enough to avoid being burned. And strong enough to survive days of heat, ash, and scraping bone. These spoons were more like paddles, really. Each had a flat edge to scrape the pot and a rounded side to scoop. Some even had carved notches near the handle so that one cook could measure out one full ration per serving. It was all math. Quiet, repetitive math. Because food had to be portioned by head count, by calorie, by urgency. A foot soldier required roughly 2,500 to 3,000 calories a day. In a marching army of 1,500 men, that meant preparing enough stew, porridge, or gruel to fill stomachs. Twice a day. That meant 12 to 15 large cauldrons in rotation, with spoons moving almost constantly, stirring, scooping, scraping, and measuring. And if the spoon snapped, or if the pot cracked, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was disaster. A field report from a Burgundian campaign in 1411 notes. On the 6th day, the great pot of meat did burst, and 2 men burned by its spilling. We ate cold thereafter. Morale lessened. A broken spoon could lead to undercooked food. Undercooked food led to sickness. Sickness led to lowered morale, desertion, or worse. So the cooks became vital. These weren't just servants, they were craftsmen, chemists, and risk managers. In French armies, they were known as valets de cuisine or écuyers de potage, often chosen not by culinary talent but by endurance. Could you stir a pot for 4 hours straight? Could you portion precisely without spilling? Could you ration salt across 3 days without resupply? In some armies, cooks were guarded by soldiers. In others, they were soldiers, rotating duties between combat and cooking, one day wielding a sword, the next a spoon. And through all of this, the spoon became personal. A soldier might eat from a shared bowl, but his spoon was his own. Kept tucked in his belt, cleaned with cloth or ash, used to scrape every last bit of fat or grain. These small eating spoons were carved in camp, made from local wood, animal horn, or sometimes whittled from broken weapon handles. One Welsh soldier wrote to his family in 1361. I send you the spoon I carved, by firelight, in the hills of Flanders. It kept me fed, and now may it stir your pot at home. A piece of the war, sent home, not a weapon, but a utensil. Back at the heart of the camp, the central kitchen remained a hub of rhythm and heat. The largest armies even had specialized wagons to carry fireproof bricks, enabling semi-permanent cooking hearths to be set up in fields. Here, cooks developed systems, layering grains at the bottom of the pot, adding brined meat last to prevent salt burn, timing root vegetables by size. These weren't gourmet meals, but they were art. And the spoon? It dictated pace. A well-trained cook could judge heat, consistency, and readiness by the resistance felt as the spoon turned through stew. A bubbling pot that gave no feedback might be boiling too violently, too much water lost. A pot that felt like wet dough might signal undercooking. The spoon didn't just move food. It measured it. And managed it. Some camps even had hierarchy, master spoonmen, who oversaw younger cooks, checked consistency, and trained others to stir without waste. A written training manual from a German mercenary camp circa 1440 contains a remarkable line. A man who stirs too little wastes meat. A man who stirs too much burns the bottom. The spoon must learn you, and you must learn it. In war, precision didn't always come from swordplay. Sometimes, it came from not overcooking the lentils. But war is rarely clean. And sometimes, there was simply no food. When grain stores were destroyed or wagons delayed, cooks faced impossible choices: thin the stew with water until it was more broth than meal. Mix herbs with boiled bark. Carve turnip peels into spoonfuls of false promise. Still, the spoon moved. It scraped whatever could be found into some resemblance of food. So what happened to the cooks when battle erupted? Some were protected. Others had to abandon their pots and run. And if they survived, they returned, because tomorrow, another pot had to be stirred. The spoon was not a weapon. But it was a ritual. The act of stirring, of moving heat and hope in a circle, again, and again, and again. But what happened when war ended? What became of the spoons that no longer stirred for armies? The war ends. Maybe it was a treaty. Maybe just exhaustion. The clashing of swords stops, the banners are rolled away, the warhorses stabled or sold. Men return to their homes, what remains of them? And what of the cooks? For many, the end of war did not mean rest. It meant reinvention. The very skills that sustained armies, precision, timing, preservation, control over chaos, were now valuable in peacetime. Former field cooks became tavern owners, monastery stewards, town bakers. Their long wooden stirring spoons, once blackened with campfire soot, found new life hanging beside warm hearths or nailed proudly above doors. Some never cooked again. Others taught the next generation how to stretch a bag of beans across a week. How to test flour for weevils. How to salt pork when the frost comes early. Their lessons were not glamorous, but they endured. Simple domestic wisdom, born on muddy roads under tents of smoke and iron. And the big spoons, the ones used in war kitchens, the great paddles of discipline and survival, those were rarely kept. Too large for homes. Too heavy for domestic pots. Some were carved into walking sticks. Others burned for firewood. A few ended up in churches, oddly enough, turned into handles for processional banners or recarved into crucifix posts. But a rare few, very rare, were passed down whole. One such spoon, belonging to a 15th-century Flemish cook named Willem de New, survives today in a museum in Ghent. It's almost 4 feet long, made of oak, scorched at one end, and polished smooth where hands once held it. A tiny inscription near the handle reads, "What ik roer, leeft. What I stir, lives." It's a quiet artifact. Visitors often pass it by. After all, it's just a spoon. But that's the essence of so much forgotten history. These tools, unglamorous, uncelebrated, shaped how people lived, ate, and endured. Soldiers may win battles, but they can't do so on an empty stomach. And stomachs aren't filled by swords. They're filled by grain, water, salt, and someone stirring it all together, hour after hour. If you follow this thread deeper, you'll find that even royal courts began to adopt the cooking methods refined in military camps. Mass feeding techniques were brought into abbeys and hospitals. Cooks who had marched with armies helped refine civic kitchens and poorhouses. In Venice and Genoa, ex-camp cooks worked in quarantine stations to feed travelers during plagues. In London, they helped establish guilds of pie makers and breaders. The humble camp cook, once a background figure in armor-stained kitchens, was now helping to define what public food meant in cities on the rise. And yet the spoon remained a symbol of something deeply personal. In surviving peasant wills from the 1500s, you'll sometimes find spoons listed among the most valued possessions. Not for their material, but for what they meant. "To my son, I leave the stirring spoon, for he kept the fire when I could not," one record reads. The act of stirring, a movement so repetitive, so quiet, became tied to ideas of care, duty, and survival. In peacetime, it meant keeping a child fed. In war, it meant keeping a soldier alive. Across both, it was a form of love. Tireless, hot, sometimes thankless, but love, nonetheless. Even folklore grew around spoons. In parts of rural France and Wales, a belief lingered that gifting a wooden spoon to a newlywed couple would ensure the home never ran out of food. In Scotland, a worn wooden spoon was considered a lucky charm, proof that a family knew how to survive hard winters. And still today, you can find old spoons nailed to farmhouse walls. The wood long since dried and cracked. The handle smooth from hands now gone. But the memory endures. Because for all the kings and battles, it was the spoon that brought warmth to cold camps. The spoon that kept men marching. The spoon that ensured one more sunrise could be met with strength instead of hunger. It stirred more than stew. It stirred history. So next time you lift a spoon, wooden or otherwise, consider its lineage. Not just a kitchen tool, but a quiet legacy of endurance.